Now let me switch gears to discuss some about Syria and to give some historical background to understanding what is actually going on right now. So up until the end of World War I, Syria was a province of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was led by the Turks. During World War I, the British and the French took advantage of the fact that the Ottoman Empire had stupidly engaged in the war and joined with the Germans and Austro-Hungarians and developed a treaty that divided up the Ottoman Empire. It was called the Sykes-Picot, P-I-C-O-T, Treaty of 1916. And what this treaty did was the equivalent of what the Berlin conferences did to Africa in 1884 and 1885, which is that it divided up the Middle East in a very irrational way. It had nothing to do with ethnic groups, religious majorities, minorities, rivers, anything. There was no logic. It was basically what the British and French wanted in terms of territories over which they would control directly or indirectly. And it's as a result of this treaty that countries emerged that had never existed before. Syria was one. Lebanon was cut out of the Syrian province and was essentially gerrymandered as a way that the French wanted it, so that there would be a Christian population that was playing a dominant role. Jordan, which was called at the time Transjordan, had not existed. Iraq had not existed. Palestine was a general area that covered what we now know as Palestine, but also parts of what became Jordan. And then, of course, Saudi Arabia had not existed, and there were other parts of the Ottoman Empire that had not been independent territories. So Syria ends up being constructed. Now, what is important, one of the things that's important here is that when Syria was carved out by the British and the French, Arabs were not consulted about this at all. And so when the French announced that there was this country called Syria that they would control, the Syrian population, Arabs there, just went nuts. And there were revolts. There were significant revolts in 1920 and 1925 against the French occupation. In fact, for those of you that have filmed us, there is a Humphrey Bogart movie that takes place during one of those uprisings called Sirocco. So Syria was carved out, and the Syria continued to be dominated by the French up until 1946, when the French pulled out. Now, when the French pulled out, it's in the context of a growing anti-colonial and nationalist movement that's spreading around the Middle East and Africa and Asia. And there was an Arab nationalist movement that starts to emerge in Syria. This nationalist movement had elements of socialism. It tended to be secular. And interestingly enough, religious movements in that time tended not to be nationalists. They weren't interested in the creation of nation states. They were interested in the creation, ultimately, of some sort of new caliphate. And they also were very conservative. Some of the religious forces in that region had collaborated to different degrees with the colonial powers. This nationalist movement also had a related kind of regional Arab, and I want to emphasize Arab for a second, interest. So there was a movement that developed in Syria and Egypt to create an Arab nation, and it came to be called the United Arab Republic, and it was the merger of Syria and Egypt, lasting for only a couple of years. Now, part of the problem, though, was that there were other nationalities in this region. And Arabs actually aren't really a nationality. They are a linguistic group and culture. And there are different tribal groups. But what really binds them together is their language and culture. But there are other groups in that same region that are not Arab. For example, the Kurds. And this becomes really important later in our story, that there are these other groups that ended up feeling at different points submerged by the Arabs. In 1963, there's a coup in Syria, and it's led by a political party that is called the Baathists, which is the Renaissance Party. And it was created initially by a man named Michel Aflaq, who wanted to have a left-wing party that was similar to the Communist Party, but was more of a nationalist force. And they become very strong in Syria and Iraq. They were also in other countries, but not as strong. The Syrian and Iraqi Baathists end up having a falling out, which also becomes important later on. But when you hear people having talked about in Iraq, the Baathists under Saddam Hussein, that's what they're talking about. But that Baathist party became a very, very repressive party in both countries. And so as opposed to being a party that was liberating people, nationalist rhetoric, but it was very, very dictatorial. And it's within the Baathist party that emerges this guy named Hafez al-Assad, who ends up taking over Syria in the 1970s. Now, some months ago, the Russians became very involved in the Syrian civil war. A lot of people were wondering, like, where did this come from? Why the Russians? And what we have to recognize or remember is that during the period of the Soviet Union had very strong relationships with the Baathist regime in Syria. And they considered the Syrian regime a very close ally. So there's a history to that relationship. This did not come out of nowhere. And even though the Soviet Union has ceased to exist, the Russian regime under Putin still sees Syria as an important place strategically in terms of the ambitions of the Russian government. Another issue before switching to discussing the Syrian revolution is that Syria has had a history of a very complicated relationship with the United States. And one of the things that confuses people is the issue of rhetoric. So it was not uncommon for the Assad regime of Hafez al-Assad or his son, Bashar, to use the rhetoric of anti-imperialism, sometimes even anti-Americanism, whereas at the same time, the Syrian government would frequently collaborate with the United States. The Syrian Baathists, because of their hatred of the Iraqi Baathists, supported the Iranians in the Iran-Iraq war that lasted from 1980 to 1988. The Syrian Baathist regime supported the United States in the Gulf War of 1991. The Assad regime also worked very closely with the United States on what was called the policy of extraordinary rendition. You may remember this. It's like after 9/11, when alleged terrorists were caught by the United States, they would sometimes be shipped to other countries where they would undergo interrogation, including various forms of torture. And the Syrian regime, despite all of its alleged anti-imperialist rhetoric, was more than happy to collaborate with the United States. It's also the case that the economic policies of Syria began to change after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was always capitalism in Syria, but there was also a high degree of state control. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the changes in the global economy, the Syrian government under both Assads started to move more and more to embrace what Bernie Sanders calls hyper-capitalism, or what is called in most parts of the world neoliberalism, where it is the promotion of privatization, casualization, getting rid of weakening unions, things along those lines. And all of this starts well before the Syrian revolution starts in 2011.